The scale of the First World War was unlike any war before it. It required millions and millions of men, but it also required millions of people back at home in factories and doing other labor intensive work to keep not only their countries running but also the men supplied at the front. Now, while some countries could dip into their colonies to make up for labor shortages, all the countries involved had a population, had a section of the population in which they could tap into in order to fill in those vacancies. And that section of the population was women. Hi, my name is Justin, aka Ghost Reader, and today we're going to talk about women's contributions to World War One. This is a video in my Remembering the First World War series, and you can find links to the other videos in this series down in the description box below. And all the sources that I'll be using for this video, you can also find in the description box as well. So the First World War was not women's introduction to the workforce. Women have been working in the factories before World War One. However, the First World War brought in even more people into the factories doing things like munitions and other industries in order to support the war effort. For example, in Britain in 1914, 3.3 million women were working in factories, but by 1917, that number had risen to 4.7. In Germany, there were 1.4 million women in the labor force, and one company in Germany, which had almost no women workers at the beginning of the war, by 1917, that number had increased to about 30% of the workforce being women. And these women worked in the manufacturing industries, the munition industries, and also in agriculture. They joined the Red Cross and other charitable organizations. They were doctors and nurses at the front lines. Now, concerning the war itself, women served as nurses, they served as doctors, and in some cases, they even served as soldiers. For example, in the United States, women joined the Red Cross, they joined the Salvation Army, and also joined the U.S. Army and Navy Nursing Corps. By June 1918, 3,000 American nurses were serving in British-run hospitals in France, and 80 doctors who were women were also sent to the front, paid for by the Women's Medical National Association. Women also were ambulance drivers and drove supplies to the front as well. Some even volunteered use of their own cars. In fact, Marie Curie, who was a pioneer of the X-ray, she made a mobile X-ray unit which could be driven to the front, and she herself was one of the operators of the machine. Also in the U.S. Navy, 12,000 women enlisted under as yeomen, and they received the same pay as men, which was about $28 a month. And they worked as mechanics, camouflage painters, radio and telephone operators. Also, the Allied High Command also created the Signal Corps women's telephone operators, which were also called the Hello Girls, and they actually were important because they were bilingual. They spoke French and English, and they were telephone operators and radio operators that helped the Army communicate back and forth and help keep the offensives going during World War One. It would not be, unfortunately, until 1977 that these women were recognized for their efforts and actually made vets by Jimmy Carter. And though for the most part in many countries women did not join the armed forces as active duty members, like going out and actually fighting in the front, this did happen, however, in Russia, Bulgaria, and Serbia. And in Russia, there was the creation of the Women's Death Battalion, which actually did with minimal training, they were sent to the front lines. However, there were other battalions created as well, but these were mainly for propaganda purposes. However, the 1st Petrograd Women's Division did take part in the defense of the Winter Palace in the October Revolution against the Soviet forces that were trying to take it over. So what were women's contributions back at the home front? So women back at home were joining and working in factories, making munitions. They were joining in transportation. They were picking up the slack where a lot of men have been taking to join the war effort. They were filling in those jobs. For example, for the first time, women were made police officers in Britain. About 50,000 of them would eventually join the British railway system. Most of this joining of the workforce was not mandatory. So while work in some countries was made mandatory, war work was made mandatory for men, it was never made mandatory for women. So for women, they were coming of their own volition to go work in the factories. And for the most part, this was patriotism, but a lot of times it was for money as well, as the money usually given by the government to families where their husbands had went off to war wasn't enough. And so a lot of these women had to had no choice but to try to find a job in the factory in order to keep the family going. However, the movement of women to the factories was not the same from country to country. In Germany, trade unions were generally against women joining in the war effort, so not as many women joined there as, say, in Britain. And in France, not a lot of women joined during the war, but before the war, France had one of the highest participation rates of women in the workforce in the world. Now, the pay for women workers was not always equal to men. In fact, there was a huge debate over what the pay should be. If you paid them too less, then they would begin to undercut the men who were also working in the factories as well. If you paid them equal amount, that was way too radical, because why should you pay women equal money for equal work? These women were working under the same conditions as their men counterparts. They were working just as hard in the factory and also facing the same dangers, such as TNT poisoning, which could cause jaundice, and also facing things like munitions explosions, which could happen and did happen from time to time. And also, working in these factories wasn't a great experience either. For example, in France, you had to work 13 days before you could get a day off. You did not get overtime with increased pay, and there was also very strict discipline by the supervisors in this factory. And this is because a lot of these factories were under pressure to produce more and more for the war effort. Like, for example, in the beginning of the war, all the major armies involved in World War I had a huge shell shortage, and that fell on the industries back in these countries to try to make that up. So as the war on and demand for things like guns and shells and clothing and boots and supplies continued to grow, so did the need for the work in the factories to continue. So for a lot of the people in this, men and women in working in these factories, they had very long days and very long weeks without days off, and for the most part did not get paid as much money as they probably should have been. And this led some women in some cases to actually strike. For example, in May 1917, women, 30,000 of them, walked out and went on strike, basically calling for better conditions and ultimately an end to the war. This, of course, scared the French government, because 30,000 women out of work means that was 30,000 people who were not producing for the war, and this could get out of hand and become more militant, especially since they were not only calling for better conditions but also for an end to the war effort. So the French government did make some concessions to them and did make conditions better. And women, for whatever reason, whether it had been money or for reasons of patriotism, they were joining and helping in the war effort in any way they could. For example, in Russia, the number of women in the factories increased from 23% to 46%. And also in Italy, about 22% of the workforce was women. In Austria, 1 million women eventually joined the workforce, and by 1915, 50% of all metal workers in Austria were actually women. However, they were making 1/3 the pay of their men counterparts. In the United States, who was in the war for a very short time, 1917 to 1918, relative to the other nations in the war, the most important opportunity for women was for African Americans, who for the most part have been domestic servants, were now moving into the workforce, as a lot of women white women who were working in the garment industry moved from the garment industry and into munitions industries. This left openings for African American women to take on those roles and join the workforce as well. Women were also invaluable to agriculture. As more and more men were going off to war, they needed people to join in the effort to produce food for the population. So in Germany, in the urban areas, women began to work allotted urban plots for food and keep small livestock. And Germany tried to urge women to go out into the countryside to do the work, but for the most part, women stayed in the urban women stayed in the urban areas, and farmers weren't really willing to jump onto the program, and the program eventually failed. However, Britain was successful in getting women to join in the seasonal land work, and they were very invaluable to collecting the harvest in Britain. Also around this time, women had been fighting for suffrage, and they were fighting for the right to vote and fighting for getting more basic rights in a lot of these countries. However, when the war came, the feminist movement split. There were some who thought that, we shouldn't have nothing to do with the war, we should not support it, and there were others who thought that we should. And in fact, those who were against the war were in the minority. And these women were very brave to take the anti-war stance, because in many of these countries, it was actually illegal to speak out publicly against the war. Also, your experience as a woman and what opportunities you got to have in order to support the war effort depended on where you were in the social ladder. So upper and middle class women who had a little bit more extra money and probably a bit more time on their hands could join in more volunteer organizations such as the Red Cross, the Salvation Army, and other volunteer organizations that volunteered and used a lot of time because they could have someone watch their kids or things like that. However, if you were one the poorer or the rural classes, you didn't really have this option. And generally, if you're rural, you're working on the farm, and if you were an urban poor class, then you were working in the factory, usually in miserable conditions of the factory. But whatever these women worked and whatever they were doing, whether that been being a nurse at the front, driving an ambulance, working in the factory, or working in the field, these women made major and important contributions to the war effort. And after the war, because of a lot of the efforts that they made during the war, eventually women were given the right to vote here in the United States in 1920. And also women in Britain who were of the age of 30 were also given the right to vote. The efforts and contributions of these women showed their male counterparts they could be more than just housewives and caregivers. In fact, they could be much, much more. If you like this video, please hit the like button. If you want to see more videos from me, please subscribe. You can follow me on Twitter at GhostReads28 and also at Goodreads. The link to that is down in the description box below. So as always, keep reading.